The old pocket watch felt heavy in Ethan Morgan's weathered hands. He rubbed his thumb across the tarnished silver case, the engraved JM barely visible after decades of wear. The timepiece hadn't worked in years, but it remained the only thing of value he'd managed to keep after losing the family ranch to the worst drought Montana had seen in 50 years. "Dad, are you ready yet?" Sarah stood in the doorway, her dark hair neatly braided, wearing her only good dress, faded blue cotton with a white collar that Ethan had spent half the night mending. At 12 years old, she had her mother's eyes and a determined spirit that sometimes took his breath away. "Almost, sweetheart." Ethan tucked the watch into his vest pocket. "Just thinking about what your grandfather would say if he could see us now. He'd say we're Morgans, and Morgans always find a way." Sarah straightened his collar. "That's what you always tell me." Ethan smiled, despite the hollow feeling in his chest. 6 months of looking for steady work had yielded nothing but odd jobs. The war had taught him to ride, shoot, and survive, but those skills meant little in a changing world. "The auction starts at 10, Sarah reminded him. "Mr. Willis at the general store said they're selling off some county land. Maybe we could find something cheap enough?" "That's the plan." Ethan stood, wincing slightly at the stiffness in his left leg where a rebel bullet had left its mark at Antietam. Outside, Silver Creek bustled with activity. The town had grown considerably since Ethan had left for the war. What had once been little more than a trading post now boasted a proper bank, hotel, and telegraph office. "Ethan Morgan. Didn't expect to see you still hanging around these parts." Carson Morgan stood on the steps of the Silver Creek Bank and Trust, his tailored suit and gold watch chain marking him as a man of means. It was hard to believe they shared the same blood. "Carson," Ethan nodded curtly. "This is still my home, last I checked." "Hello, Uncle Carson," Sarah said politely. Carson barely acknowledged her. "Heard you're still looking for work. Shame about the ranch. Father always said that land would sustain Morgans for generations." The drought had other ideas. Or perhaps proper management might have made the difference. Carson adjusted his cufflinks. "I warned you about taking out that second mortgage. I didn't come looking for financial advice, Carson, especially not from someone who refused to help his own brother when he needed it. Business is business, Ethan. The bank doesn't make exceptions for family." Carson's eyes narrowed. "I see you're headed to the auction, planning to invest what little you have left in more property you can't afford to keep?" Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised. "My father knows what he's doing, and at least he tries, instead of just talking about how other people should live." Pride swelled in Ethan's chest. "We should be going. The auction starts soon." The courthouse square was already crowded when they arrived. Farmers, merchants, and speculators gathered in small groups, discussing potential purchases in hushed tones. "Lot of people here," Sarah whispered. "Think we stand a chance?" "We'll see, sweetheart. Even if we only get a small plot, it would be a start." Ethan squeezed her hand. "Something that's ours." The auctioneer, Francis Dawson, took his position on the courthouse steps at precisely 10 o'clock. Beside him stood Sheriff Nathan Cooper, officially overseeing the proceedings. The sheriff gave Ethan an almost imperceptible nod of recognition. They had served together briefly during the war. The first several lots were farmland parcels, each quickly claimed by wealthy speculators for prices far beyond Ethan's means. By midday, only 3 lots remained. Next up, Lot 13, a parcel of 12 acres with existing structure located at Crow's Ridge, approximately 5 miles north of town. Opening bid $20. Ethan quickly raised his hand. $20. He waited for competing bids, but instead, a strange silence fell over the courthouse square. People shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. No one raised a hand. "Do I hear 25? Dawson called, his enthusiasm noticeably dampened. More silence. Ethan looked around in confusion. Several people actively stepped backward, as if distancing themselves from the proceedings. $20 going once. Carson appeared at the edge of the crowd, watching with an unreadable expression. Near him stood Victor Blackwood, the local lumber merchant, whispering something to Thomas Reynolds, who owned half the businesses on Main Street. $20 going twice. 25 cents. The words left Ethan's mouth before he fully considered them. This time, the murmur that spread through the crowd held a different quality. Not surprise or outrage, but something that sounded almost like pity. 25 cents from Mr. Morgan, Dawson repeated, his voice strangely hollow. An elderly woman stepped forward. Eleanor Bennett had been the town's midwife for as long as anyone could remember. "You don't want that place, son," she said quietly, her weathered hand gripping her shawl tightly. "Trust me on this." Before Ethan could respond, Dawson's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold to Ethan Morgan for 25 cents. The crowd dispersed immediately, conversations resuming in urgent whispers. As Ethan approached the auctioneer's bubble, he caught fragments of hushed conversations. "Should have told him about Hayes. No one's been inside for 15 years. What happened to the last man who tried?" Dawson handed him the deed with shaking hands, avoiding eye contact. When Ethan asked about the property's history, the man simply shook his head and walked away. Sheriff Cooper approached, his expression grim. "Congratulations on your purchase, Morgan." "Nathan," Ethan acknowledged. "Want to tell me why everyone's acting like I just signed my own death warrant?" Cooper glanced around. "That cabin has history, Ethan. Bad history." "What kind of history justifies selling 12 acres for 25 cents? The kind that makes people prefer to stay away." Cooper adjusted his gun belt. "It belonged to Joseph Hayes. Name mean anything to you?" Ethan shook his head. "Local newspaper man. Came here about 17 years ago. Started asking questions nobody wanted answered. Found himself on the wrong end of a bullet 15 years back." The sheriff's voice dropped lower. "Never did find who did it." Sarah joined them, excitement written across her face despite the strange atmosphere. "We have our own place now, Dad, with land and everything." Cooper's expression softened. "You take care out there, Morgan. Crow's Ridge is isolated. If you need anything..." He trailed off, leaving the offer unspoken but clear. As they turned to leave, Ethan noticed many townspeople still lingered, watching him from a distance, as if waiting for something they'd seen before. The ride to their new property felt longer than the 5 miles it covered. The path wound through stands of pine and rocky outcroppings, climbing steadily toward the ridge. Sarah rode behind Ethan on their old mare, chattering excitedly about what their new home might look like. The trail eventually opened into a clearing. The cabin sat against a backdrop of tall pines, smaller than Ethan had expected but solidly built. A well stood nearby, its wooden cover weathered but intact. Beyond stretched open land that could support a small herd of cattle or a decent crop. "It's perfect," Sarah breathed, sliding from the horse. "It needs work," he cautioned, surveying the overgrown grass and sagging roof. "But it's ours." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "No one can take it away." Ethan tied their horse to a post and approached the front door. The handle turned easily, too easily for a place supposedly abandoned for 15 years. Inside, dust particles danced in the afternoon light. A simple table sat against one wall, 2 chairs tucked neatly beneath it. A stone fireplace dominated the opposite wall, cold ashes still piled in the grate. "Dad, look!" Sarah called from the center of the room. "The floor is different here." In the center of the room, the wooden planks were arranged differently than the rest, deliberately cut and fitted to create a perfect square, as if someone had built a trap door, then sealed it permanently shut. Ethan knelt and ran his fingers along the edges. The seams were tight, filled with a dark substance that had hardened over time, a mixture of pine resin and beeswax. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure this section would never be opened again. A shadow passed across the window. Ethan looked up to see a figure on horseback watching them from the tree line. When their eyes met through the grimy glass, the figure immediately rode away, but not before Ethan caught a glimpse of something familiar. The rider wore a distinctive wide-brimmed hat with a silver band, the same hat he had seen on Victor Blackwood at the auction. "Dad?" Sarah's voice pulled him back. "What is it?" "Nothing," and he lied. "Just thought I saw a deer." They spent the remainder of the afternoon assessing their property. The roof needed work, but the walls were solid. The well yielded clear, cold water. The land was good, better than expected. As evening approached, they reluctantly prepared to return to town for supplies. The general store was nearly empty when they arrived. Martin Jenkins, the storekeeper, barely met Ethan's eyes. "Need some tools," Ethan said, placing coins on the counter. "Hammer, saw, nails, some roof tar, if you've got it." "Fixing up a place?" Jenkins' hands trembled slightly as he gathered the items. "The cabin on Crow's Ridge," Ethan confirmed. Just bought it today. Every customer in the store turned to look at him. A woman near the fabric counter dropped her sewing basket. An elderly man by the window shook his head slowly, as if witnessing something tragic. As Ethan counted out the money, the store's back door opened. Victor Blackwood stepped inside, his silver-banded hat now held in his hands. "Morgan," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Heard you made quite the purchase today." "Word travels fast." Ethan shook his hand briefly. "Small town." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to make you an offer. $500 for that cabin, cash in hand tonight." Jenkins dropped a jar of preserves. The crash echoed through the sudden silence. "That's quite a profit," Ethan said carefully. "Why would you pay so much for something nobody else wanted?" "Let's just say I have sentimental attachments to the place." "Sentimental enough to watch it from the trees?" Blackwood's hand moved slightly closer to his hip, where a revolver nestled in a worn leather holster. "I've been keeping an eye on that property for a long time, making sure nobody disturbs what should stay undisturbed. But now that someone owns it legally," he pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. $200. Final offer." Ethan looked around the store. Every face reflected the same message. Take the money and leave. "I appreciate the offer," Ethan said, backing toward the door, "but I think I'll hold on to my investment." Blackwood's expression darkened. "That would be unwise." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm trying to save your life." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah pressed closer to Ethan's side, her earlier excitement replaced by fear. Before Blackwood could explain, the sound of multiple horses approaching made everyone freeze. Through the window, Ethan could see 3 riders dismounting in front of the store. "Too late," Blackwood whispered. "They know you found it." The 3 men who entered the store moved with purpose. The first, tall and lean with a deputy's badge, scanned the room before his eyes settled on Ethan. The second was Thomas Reynolds, well-dressed with soft hands. The third kept his hand on his gun and positioned himself by the door. "Blackwood," Reynolds announced, "I thought we had an understanding about this situation." "I offered him fair money. He refused." "Fair money?" Reynolds laughed without humor. "You offered him enough to buy a large ranch. Don't you think that might make him curious about why?" "Gentlemen," Ethan interrupted, "I don't know what's got you all so worked up about a rundown cabin, but you opened the floor yet?" The deputy cut him off. Every person in the store sucked in their breath at once. Jenkins backed away from his own counter. "What floor?" Ethan asked, though he already knew. Reynolds stepped closer. "The sealed section. Don't pretend you didn't notice it. Everyone who's ever been in that cabin notices it. That's why nobody's lived there for 15 years. What's underneath?" "Nothing that concerns you," the deputy said sharply. "You'd be wise to take Blackwood's offer and forget you ever saw that cabin." Sarah suddenly spoke up. "It's our home now. We paid for it fair and square." Reynolds looked at her as if noticing her for the first time. Something in his expression shifted. "You have a daughter. All the more reason to walk away from this, Morgan. Take the money. Leave Silver Creek. Start fresh somewhere else." "Not until someone tells me what's going on." Ethan placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. "What's under that floor that's worth $500 to keep hidden?" The store's front door opened again. Eleanor Bennett entered, her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill. "Tell him, Thomas," she said. "He deserves to know what he's gotten himself into." "Eleanor, this doesn't concern you. It concerns anyone with a conscience." She turned to Ethan. "Joseph Hayes was a good man, a journalist who came here to report on the silver boom. But he discovered something about the land deals in this county, something that involved very important people selling the same property to multiple buyers, pocketing the money and disappearing." "That's enough," the deputy moved toward Eleanor, but she continued speaking faster. "Hayes had proof, names, dates, forged documents. He was going to expose the whole operation, but they got to him first, shot in the back while riding to town. Those papers under that floor could destroy half the wealthy families in 3 counties. The store went silent. Ethan owned property that contained evidence of a massive fraud scheme, evidence that powerful people had killed to protect. "Now you understand," Blackwood said quietly, "why I offered you $500 to walk away." The deputy's hand moved to his gun. "Too bad he knows too much now. We can't let him leave. Before he could draw his weapon, Eleanor stepped between him and Ethan. You'll have to shoot me first, Deputy Collins, she said calmly, and I don't think you are prepared to murder an old woman in front of a store full of witnesses. Collins's hand hesitated. He looked to Reynolds for direction, but the well-dressed man was staring at Ethan with calculating eyes. There might be another way, Reynolds said slowly. What if Mr. Morgan here became our partner instead of our problem? Blackwood scoffed. You can't be serious. Think about it. He legally owns the property. He can retrieve those documents without breaking any laws. We split whatever Joseph Hayes hid under there and everyone walks away rich. What makes you think there's money down there? Ethan asked. Eleanor said it was evidence of fraud. Hayes wasn't just collecting evidence, Reynolds explained. He was collecting payment from the people he was planning to expose. Extortion, some might call it. Others might call it justice. Either way, he had accumulated quite a fortune before someone decided to silence him permanently. How much money are we talking about? Enough to buy half the territory, Collins answered. Maybe more. What's to stop you from shooting me the moment I hand over whatever's down there? Ethan asked. Because we need you alive, Reynolds replied. You're the only one with legal right to that property. Without you, we're just grave robbers. With you, we're business partners. Eleanor shook her head. Don't trust them, Ethan. They killed Hayes. They'll kill you, too. We didn't kill Joseph Hayes, Collins said. But we know who did, and if those documents see daylight, that person will kill anyone connected to them. Who killed Hayes? Ethan asked. The three men exchanged glances. Finally, Blackwood spoke. Someone with enough power to make this whole town forget it ever happened. Someone who's been watching that cabin for 15 years, waiting for the day someone would be foolish enough to buy it. The auction was public record, Reynolds added. By tomorrow, half the territory will know that cabin has a new owner. Which means you have tonight, maybe less, Collins said. Once word spreads, they'll come for you. So what's it going to be? Reynolds asked. Partner with us and live rich, or try to handle this alone and end up like Joseph Hayes? Ethan looked down at Sarah, whose face had gone pale with fear. This morning they had nothing. Now they had a home, but at what cost? I need time to think, he said finally. You don't have time, Collins growled. They could be on their way already. One night, Ethan insisted. We'll meet at the cabin tomorrow at dawn. I'll give you my answer then. Reynolds studied him, then nodded. Dawn it is. But don't try anything foolish, Morgan. There's nowhere in the territory you could hide. After they left the store, Ethan and Sarah walked in silence to their rented room. Only when they were inside with the door locked did she speak. Are we in danger, Dad? Yes, sweetheart, I think we are. Because of what's under the floor? Because powerful people will do anything to keep their secrets buried. A soft knock sounded at their door. His hand went to his revolver as he approached cautiously. Who is it? Eleanor Bennett, came the quiet reply. I'm alone. Ethan confirmed she was indeed alone before letting her inside. The old woman looked even more frail in the dim lamplight, but her eyes burned with intensity. I couldn't let you face this without knowing the whole truth, she said. Joseph Hayes came to Silver Creek 17 years ago to report on the silver boom. He discovered that Judge Richard Hamilton was authorizing land sales for parcels that didn't exist or had already been sold to others. The judge? Ethan's surprise was genuine. Judge Hamilton was the most respected man in the territory. The judge, the bank, the land office, all working together to swindle honest people. Your brother Carson was part of it too, handling the banking side of things. The revelation struck Ethan like a physical blow. You're saying my own brother was part of this scheme? He came into it later, after your father died and he took over the bank. Hayes collected evidence for months, copies of fake deeds, lists of victims, proof of payoffs, but he made a fatal mistake. He tried to blackmail the conspirators instead of exposing them outright, and they killed him for it. Not they, Eleanor corrected. Judge Hamilton himself. I saw it happen. I was gathering herbs on the ridge that morning when Hayes rode past. The judge was waiting in the trees. One shot, and it was done. Why didn't you tell anyone? Who would believe me over the most powerful man in the territory? And after Hayes died, Hamilton made it clear that anyone who spoke up would meet the same fate. She looked directly at Sarah. I'm only telling you now because you and your daughter are already in danger. After Eleanor left, Ethan sat beside Sarah. The weight of decision pressed down on him. They could run, take what little they had, and disappear before dawn. But where would they go? How far would they need to travel to escape the reach of a territorial judge? We can't leave, Sarah said suddenly. That cabin is ours. We paid for it fair and square. It's not that simple, sweetheart. It is that simple. She took his weathered hand in her small one. You always taught me that running from bullies only makes them stronger. If we run now, we'll be running forever. Another knock at the door, harder this time, urgent. Ethan drew his revolver, motioning for Sarah to move behind the bed. Morgan, it's Sheriff Cooper. Open up. Cooper stood in the hallway, his expression grim. I just got word that Judge Hamilton is calling an emergency night court session. Claims there was an irregularity with today's auction. He's trying to invalidate my purchase of the cabin. That would be my guess. Reynolds and the others are being called as witnesses. Cooper removed his hat. Something big is happening. Ethan, the whole town's on edge. Do you know about Hayes? About what happened 15 years ago? Cooper's eyes darted to Sarah, then back to Ethan. Mun here. Meet me at the livery stable in 20 minutes. Alone. After the sheriff left, Ethan began gathering their few possessions. We need to move quickly. I want you to go to Mrs. Bennett's house. She'll keep you safe while I meet with the sheriff. No, Sarah stood firmly, arms crossed. I'm not letting you out of my sight. Sarah, please. No, Dad. We stay together always. That's what Mom made me promise before she died. All right, he conceded, but you stay close and do exactly as I say. They slipped out the back of the boarding house into the alley. The night had grown darker, clouds obscuring the stars. Silver Creek seemed unnaturally quiet. As they made their way toward the livery stable, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Cooper was waiting in the shadows of the stable doorway. He ushered them quickly inside, securing the door behind them. I told you to come alone, he hissed, spotting Sarah. She stays with me, Ethan said firmly. Now tell me what you know. Cooper ran a hand through his thinning hair. I've been sheriff here for 8 years. Always knew something wasn't right with the land deals, but could never prove anything. Hayes was getting close, then he turned up dead. Eleanor Bennett says Judge Hamilton killed him. Wouldn't surprise me. Hamilton runs this county like his personal kingdom. Cooper lowered his voice further, but he answers to someone even more powerful. Governor Wilson himself. The governor is involved in land fraud. Up to his neck. The territorial government has been stealing federal land grants for years, selling the same parcels multiple times, pocketing the profits. Hamilton, Reynolds, your brother, they're all just middlemen. Cooper pulled a folded paper from his vest. I can't openly defy the judge. He'd have me removed and replaced before morning. But I can give you this. He handed the paper to Ethan. It's a writ of property confirmation. Once registered with the Territorial Land Office, it makes your ownership of that cabin permanent, immune even to judicial review. Why would you help us? Sarah asked. Cooper looked at her with something like sadness. Because 15 years ago, I watched a good man get murdered for telling the truth and I did nothing. I've been living with that ever since. A sudden commotion outside interrupted them. Horses approaching at speed, men's voices calling orders. Cooper drew his gun, moving quickly to the window. Judge's men, he muttered. They must have followed you. You need to go, now. Use the back door. Head for the cabin. If you can get those documents, take them straight to U.S. Marshal Davis in Helena. He's the only one with enough authority to stand against Hamilton and the governor. What about you? I'll delay them as long as I can. Cooper pressed the stable's back door key into Ethan's hand. Get your daughter to safety, Morgan. And when this is over, remember who helped you. They slipped out the stable's back entrance into the darkness. Behind them, they could hear Cooper confronting the approaching men, his voice carrying authority. Ethan led Sarah toward the edge of town, keeping to the shadows. As they reached the last row of buildings, a shape detached itself from the darkness ahead. Ethan pushed Sarah behind him, raising his revolver. Easy, Morgan, came a familiar voice. I'm alone. Carson Morgan stepped into a patch of moonlight, his banker's suit exchanged for riding clothes. What do you want, Carson? To warn you, Hamilton's called an emergency court session to invalidate your purchase. When that's done, he'll issue a warrant for your arrest on charges of trespassing and theft. Theft of what? Whatever's under that cabin floor. Carson's expression was unreadable in the dim light. The whole town knows you're heading there. They'll be right behind you. Why tell me this? Eleanor says you're part of their scheme. I joined the bank after father died. By then, the fraud was well established. I just processed the paperwork, looked the other way when I should have then asked questions. He glanced at Sarah. I've done things I'm not proud of, brother, but I've never taken a life, and I don't intend to start with my own niece. So you're helping us out of family loyalty? Ethan's tone made it clear he didn't believe it. I'm helping you because I want out. This whole thing is about to collapse, and I don't intend to be crushed when it does. Carson handed Ethan a sealed envelope. Inside is an affidavit detailing everything I know about the land fraud scheme. It won't be enough to bring down Hamilton or the governor, but it might keep you alive long enough to find what Hayes hid. A shout went up from the direction of the stable. Morgan's gone. Check the roads. Carson pointed to a small path leading away from the main road. That's the old mining trail. It'll take you to the back side of Crow's Ridge. It's rough going, but they won't expect you to go that way. Ethan hesitated, years of distrust warring with the urgency of their situation. Finally, he nodded. If you're setting us up, Carson— I know, his brother interrupted. Just go. And when this is over, remember that I tried to help. The mysterious letter with no signature arrived just as they prepared to leave their temporary hideout at first light. A final warning to abandon the cabin if they wished to live. The crude paper, pushed under their door during the night, only heightened their determination. As dawn broke over Crow's Ridge, father and daughter faced the most dangerous day of their lives, not knowing that the 25-cent purchase would forever change their fate in the history of Silver Creek itself. The old mining trail was barely visible in the darkness, winding treacherously between rocky outcroppings and loose shale. Ethan led the way, one hand firmly grasping Sarah's, the other holding a small lantern. Behind them, faint shouts and the distant thunder of hooves suggested their pursuers had discovered their absence. Are we going to make it? Sarah whispered, her voice small against the vastness of the night. We're going to make it, Ethan assured her, with more confidence than he felt. Just a little further. The trail eventually emerged on the far side of Crow's Ridge, bringing them to the back of their property. The cabin was a dark silhouette against the night sky, its weathered logs silver in the moonlight. No lights, no movement. If anyone was watching the place, they were well hidden. They approached cautiously, moving from shadow to shadow. Ethan pressed his ear against the rough logs, listening for any sound that might indicate someone was inside. Nothing. The front door would likely be watched, so that left only one option. We'll have to break the window, he whispered. Once we're inside, we need to work fast. Ethan wrapped his jacket around his arm and struck the window with his elbow. The glass shattered with a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. They waited, breath held, for any reaction, but the forest remained still. Carefully, Ethan cleared the remaining glass and helped Sarah through before following her inside. The cabin's interior was pitch black. Ethan lit the lantern, keeping the flame low. The sealed section of floor seemed to draw the light to itself, the dark substance filling its seams gleaming dully. We need to find something to pry up those boards, Ethan said, setting the lantern on the table. They searched the cabin quickly, finding an old iron fireplace poker and a rusted kitchen knife. Not ideal, but they would have to do. Ethan knelt beside the sealed floor, examining it more closely. The work had been professional, designed to last for years. The mixture of pine resin and beeswax had hardened like stone, preserving whatever secrets lay beneath. He worked the tip of the poker into a small crack, applying steady pressure. The seal resisted, then gave way with a sharp crack. Sarah watched, wide-eyed, as Ethan carefully pried up the first board. The wood was surprisingly well preserved, suggesting the seal had protected it from moisture and insects. "Dad," Sarah whispered, pointing to the window. "Someone's out there." Ethan immediately extinguished the lantern. In the sudden darkness, they could see a faint glow moving among the trees. Lanterns, at least 3 of them, approaching from the direction of the main road. "They found us." Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "We still have time." Ethan worked faster, levering up board after board with the poker. Each one came free with a protesting groan of nails and old wood. Help me stack them against the wall. Together they removed the last of the sealed boards, revealing a cavity beneath the floor about 3 feet square and 2 feet deep. The space had been carefully lined with oilcloth to protect its contents from the damp earth below. Look, Sarah gasped as Ethan relit the lantern. Inside the cavity were 2 items, a small iron strongbox with a heavy padlock and a leather document satchel. The kind lawyers carried, either expensive and well-made, its leather still supple despite the years. Get the satchel, Ethan instructed, reaching for the strongbox. It was surprisingly heavy, heavier than it should have been if it contained only papers. As he lifted it from the cavity, something clinked inside. Sounds like coins. The voices outside grew louder. Men calling to each other, horses snorting and stamping. There was no more time. Back window, Ethan whispered, tucking the strongbox under one arm and grabbing Sarah's hand with the other. Stay low. They had just reached the back wall when the front door burst open. Ethan barely had time to blow out the lantern before men crowded into the cabin. In the sudden darkness, he could make out their silhouettes against the moonlight streaming through the doorway. 3 men, maybe 4, led by a tall figure in a long coat. Search the place, a commanding voice ordered. They've been here. Look at the floor. Ethan pulled Sarah toward the back window they'd entered through. If they could just slip out unnoticed, they might have a chance to escape into the forest. But as they reached the window, a voice called from outside. They're at the back. I can see them. Lantern light flooded the cabin as someone struck a match. Ethan found himself staring into the cold eyes of Judge Richard Hamilton, the most powerful man in the territory. Beside him stood Deputy Collins, his hand already on his gun. Mr. Morgan? Hamilton's voice was cultured, almost pleasant. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Ethan pushed Sarah behind him, placing the strongbox on the floor. This cabin and everything in it belongs to me. I paid for it fair and square. A clever legal maneuver, I'll admit. Hamilton stepped further into the room, his eyes taking in the open cavity in the floor. But ultimately futile, the auction was invalid. I've already signed the order. Then why come all the way out here in the middle of the night? Ethan's hand inched toward his revolver. Why not just serve me with papers in the morning? Hamilton smiled thinly. We both know why. His gaze fell on the leather satchel clutched in Sarah's hands. The girl has the documents. Take them. Collins moved forward, but Ethan drew his gun with lightning speed, leveling it at the deputy's chest. Not another step. You're outnumbered, Morgan, Hamilton said calmly. 5 of my men outside, 3 in here. Even if you managed to shoot 1 or 2 of us, you wouldn't make it out alive. And then what happens to your daughter? Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He was backed into a corner with no good options. Sarah pressed against his side, her face pale but determined. You'll kill us anyway, Ethan said, once you have what you want. Not necessarily. Hamilton adjusted his gloves, the picture of casual authority. I'm a reasonable man. All I want are the Hayes documents. What you do after that is of no concern to me, provided you leave the territory and never return. Like you let Hayes leave? Sarah's voice was surprisingly steady. Mrs. Bennett told us what you did to him. Something flickered across Hamilton's face. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. Eleanor Bennett should be more careful about the stories she tells. It's not a story if it's true, Ethan said. She saw you murder Hayes, shot him in the back like a coward. Hamilton's urbane mask slipped on for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. An unfortunate necessity. Hayes discovered things he shouldn't have, things that threatened the stability and prosperity of this entire territory. You mean he discovered your land fraud scheme, Ethan pressed, selling the same parcels to multiple buyers, stealing from honest people. Progress requires sacrifice, Mr. Morgan. The railroad wouldn't have come through Silver Creek without certain arrangements. The mines wouldn't have been developed. This territory wouldn't be on the path to statehood. Hamilton gestured dismissively. A few land disputes seem a small price to pay for such progress. Tell that to the families who lost everything, Ethan countered. People who scraped together their life savings to buy land that wasn't yours to sell. Outside, more horses arrived, Through the window, Ethan could see additional lanterns moving through the trees. The judge's reinforcements had arrived. Their chance of escape was dwindling by the second. Hamilton seemed to sense his advantage. The strong box in the satchel, Morgan. Now, or my men start shooting. Ethan's mind raced, desperately seeking a way out. Then from the darkness outside, a new voice called in. Hamilton, it's Cooper. We need to talk. Sheriff Nathan Cooper's distinctive voice carried clearly through the night air. Hamilton frowned, turning toward the doorway. What is it, Sheriff? I'm rather busy at the moment. Cooper appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand. Behind him stood several men from town, including Martin Jenkins from the general store and two miners Ethan recognized from the auction. All were armed. These men have some concerns about land deeds they purchased, Cooper said evenly. Seems they discovered they all own the same parcel. Imagine their surprise when they compared notes. Hamilton's face hardened. This is hardly the time or place for such matters. I disagree. Cooper stepped into the cabin, his rifle not quite pointed at the judge, but not pointed away either. See, once they started talking, other folks joined in. Found out they had the same problem. Funny coincidence. The balance of power in the room had shifted. Hamilton glanced at his men, clearly recalculating his odds. This is sedition, Cooper, Hamilton said coldly. I'll have your badge for this. Maybe, but right now I've got about 20 armed men outside who've been cheated out of their life savings. They seem more immediate than your threats. Cooper nodded toward Ethan. You all right, Morgan? Been better, Ethan admitted, keeping his gun trained on Collins. The girl? Cooper asked. I'm fine, Sheriff, Sarah answered, her voice stronger now. Cooper turned back to Hamilton. Here's what's going to happen. Morgan and his daughter are coming with me. Whatever they found under that floor comes too. Tomorrow we all head to Helena to see Marshal Davis about these land fraud allegations. You're making a grave mistake, Hamilton warned. Governor Wilson won't stand for this interference. Cooper's expression hardened. That's the thing about governors, Judge. They tend to distance themselves mighty quick when scandal hits, especially when there's proof. Sarah held up the leather satchel. Like these letters with the governor's seal? The ones ordering Mr. Hayes to be killed? Hamilton's composure cracked visibly. Give me those documents, girl. Not a chance, Ethan said, stepping between them. Sarah, go with Sheriff Cooper. Dad. Go, Ethan insisted. I'll be right behind you. Cooper extended his hand to Sarah. Come on, girl. Your father knows what he's doing. Sarah hesitated, clutching the satchel tightly, then darted toward Cooper. Hamilton lunged for her, but Ethan was faster, driving the butt of his revolver into the judge's stomach. Hamilton doubled over, gasping. Collins, stop them! Hamilton wheezed. The deputy hesitated, looking from his employer to the armed townsman now filling the doorway. Self-preservation won out. He slowly raised his hands. Sorry, Judge. This isn't what I signed up for. Coward, Hamilton spat, struggling to regain his breath. Cooper guided Sarah outside, calling back to Ethan. Morgan, grab what you need and let's go. I don't trust the judge's men to stay peaceful much longer. Ethan bent to retrieve the strongbox, never taking his eyes off Hamilton. The judge had recovered somewhat, straightening up with a grimace of pain. The cold calculation was back in his eyes. You have no idea what forces you're challenging, Morgan, he said quietly. Governor Wilson has connections all the way to Washington. This won't end well for you. Maybe not, Ethan acknowledged, but it's ending right now for you. As Ethan backed toward the door, Hamilton made one desperate lunge, reaching inside his coat. Ethan didn't hesitate. His revolver barked once, the sound deafening in the confined space. Hamilton staggered, a look of genuine surprise on his face, as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. You shot me. The judge sounded more bewildered than angry. He sank to his knees, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck, blood seeping between his fingers. Dad! Sarah's frightened cry came from outside. I'm all right, Ethan called back, never taking his eyes off the wounded judge. Stay with Cooper. Collins moved toward his employer, examining the wound. It's not fatal, just a shoulder wound, but he'll need a doctor. See to it, Ethan said, backing out the door with the strongbox. Make sure he lives to face justice for what he did to Hayes. See to it, Ethan said, backing out the door with the strongbox. I didn't come here to kill anyone. Outside, the situation had devolved into a tense standoff. The judge's men were outnumbered by the townspeople Cooper had brought, but they were better armed and likely more experienced fighters. Only the uncertainty of the moment kept violence at bay. Cooper had positioned Sarah behind the protective circle of townsmen. Ethan made his way to them, strongbox clutched under one arm, revolver still in his hand. "Hamilton?" Cooper asked quietly. "Wounded, not dead," Ethan replied. "Collins is seeing to him." Cooper nodded grimly. "We need to move. Once they regroup, they'll come after us." "Where to?" "Eleanor Bennett's place. It's closest, and they won't expect us to stay so near." They moved as a group through the darkness, making their way down the ridge toward the small valley where Eleanor's cottage stood. The elderly midwife lived alone on the outskirts of town, her small farm protected by its reputation as a place of healing. Even the judge's men might hesitate to violate such a sanctuary. The cottage was dark when they arrived, but a soft glow appeared at the window almost immediately after Cooper's knock. Eleanor opened the door, wrapped in a shawl, her white hair loose around her shoulders. "I've been expecting you," she said simply, stepping aside to let them in. "Bring him in quickly." Ethan paused in confusion. "Bring who in?" Eleanor pointed beyond them into the darkness. "There, by the oak tree." Cooper raised his lantern, illuminating a figure slumped against a massive oak some 50 yards from the house. To Ethan's shock, it was Carson, his brother's fine clothes torn and bloodied. "Carson!" Ethan handed the strongbox to Cooper and ran to his brother's side. Carson was barely conscious, his face bruised, a deep gash across his forehead seeping blood. "Ethan," Carson mumbled, his eyes struggling to focus. "They know about the affidavit. Reynolds, he found out I warned you." "Don't talk." Ethan hoisted his brother up, supporting his weight. "We need to get you inside." With Cooper's help, they carried Carson into Eleanor's cottage. The interior was warm and fragrant with herbs hanging from the rafters. Eleanor quickly cleared her kitchen table, spreading a clean cloth over it. "Lay him here," she instructed, already gathering supplies from various shelves and cupboards. "Sarah, fetch water from the pump. Cooper, I need more light." While they tended to Carson, Ethan opened the strongbox. The lock had given way easily with a few blows from Eleanor's iron poker. Inside, neatly stacked, were banknotes and gold coins, exactly as Reynolds had described. Hayes had indeed been collecting payment from those he threatened to expose. Ethan estimated there was at least $8,000, a fortune that represented the journalist's blackmail payments. Beneath the money lay a small, leather-bound journal. Ethan opened it carefully, finding page after page of meticulous notes in a tight, precise hand. Names, dates, amounts. Hayes had documented everything. Each entry corresponded to a land parcel, showing the original sale and then multiple subsequent sales of the same property. Beside each transaction was a name, the official who had authorized it. Judge Hamilton's name appeared most frequently, but there were others: Thomas Reynolds, William Davis from the land office, and, Ethan's heart sank, Carson Morgan. "How is he?" Ethan asked, moving to his brother's side. Eleanor was cleaning the wound on Carson's head with a solution that smelled strongly of alcohol. "The head wound is superficial, but he has 2 broken ribs and possibly internal bleeding. He's been badly beaten." Carson's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Ethan. "The documents," he whispered. "Did you get them?" "We got them," Ethan confirmed. "All of Hayes's evidence. Your name is in his journal, Carson." Shame flickered across Carson's battered face. "I know, I told you. I'm not proud of what I did." "Why did they do this to you?" "Reynolds found out about the affidavit I gave you, said I was a traitor." Carson winced as Eleanor applied a poultice to his head wound. "They wanted to know where you'd gone. I wouldn't tell them." Ethan felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at his brother's involvement in the fraud, grudging respect for his refusal to betray them, and the deep, instinctive concern of one brother for another. "You need to rest," he said finally. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." Cooper had been examining the documents from the satchel, spreading them across Eleanor's small writing desk. His expression grew increasingly grim as he worked through the material. "This goes beyond Silver Creek," he said, holding up a letter bearing the territorial governor's seal. "Governor Wilson wasn't just aware of the fraud, he orchestrated it. Federal land grants meant for settlement were diverted, sold multiple times, with the profits flowing back to the capital. And to the judge and his cronies, Ethan added. The governor ordered Hayes killed, Sarah said quietly. She had been helping Eleanor tend to Carson, but now stood beside Cooper at the desk. It's right there in that letter. Cooper nodded gravely. With this evidence, we could bring down the entire territorial government. If we live long enough to present it, Ethan observed. The night wore on. Eleanor tended to Carson while Ethan, Sarah, and Cooper took turns keeping watch. The townsmen Cooper had brought had dispersed, returning to their homes with promises to reconvene at dawn. No one was under any illusion that Hamilton's men would give up so easily. As the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky, Carson's condition worsened. His breathing grew labored, and a bluish tinge appeared around his lips. Eleanor, who had dozed briefly in her rocking chair, was immediately at his side. Internal bleeding, she confirmed grimly after examining him. I've seen it before. The bruising is spreading inside. Can you help him? Ethan asked, the old childhood protectiveness resurging despite everything. Eleanor shook her head slowly. I can make him comfortable, but he needs a proper doctor. Maybe surgery. The nearest doctor is in Helena, Cooper said. 2 days' ride, even pushing hard. Carson coughed weakly, blood speckling his lips. No time for that, he rasped. Ethan, listen to me. Ethan leaned closer. I'm here. The night Hayes was killed, Carson whispered, each word clearly costing him. I was there, not at the murder, but after. Hamilton came to the bank, blood on his coat, made me open the safe. He took something, a deed, said it was the reason Hayes had to die. What kind of deed? Railroad land grant, biggest one in the territory. Hayes had discovered it was fraudulent. The Northern Pacific line built on stolen land. Carson's eyes closed momentarily, the effort of speaking exhausting him. That deed is the key. Hamilton keeps it in his office, behind the portrait of Washington. Ethan exchanged glances with Cooper. If that deed proves the railroad's claim is invalid, it would invalidate every development along the line, Cooper finished. Towns, mines, businesses, all built on land that wasn't legally sold. The economic impact would be catastrophic. But so many people were cheated, Sarah protested. Don't they deserve justice? Justice isn't always simple, child, Eleanor said softly, bathing Carson's forehead with a cool cloth. Sometimes there are no solutions that don't hurt innocent people. A commotion outside interrupted their discussion. Cooper moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. Riders, he reported, at least a dozen. Reynolds is leading them. Ethan joined him at the window. Sure enough, Thomas Reynolds was approaching the cottage, flanked by armed men. There was no sign of Judge Hamilton, which meant either the judge's wound had been more serious than Ethan thought, or Reynolds had seized the opportunity to take control. They've surrounded the place, Ethan observed grimly. No way out. What do we do, Dad? Sarah asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the danger. Before Ethan could answer, there was a pounding at the door. Reynolds' voice carried clearly through the morning air. Cooper, Morgan, we know you're in there. Send out the documents and the strongbox, and we'll let you live. Cooper snorted. Like they let Hayes live? I need to go out there, Carson said suddenly, struggling to sit up. Let me talk to Reynolds. You can barely stand, Ethan objected. Exactly. They won't see me as a threat. Carson gripped Ethan's arm with surprising strength. Trust me, brother. For once in our lives, trust me. Ethan hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, but at the first sign of trouble, we're pulling you back in. With Cooper and Ethan supporting him on either side, Carson made his way to the door. Eleanor and Sarah stayed back, gathering the documents and securing them in the satchel. If things went badly, perhaps they could escape through the back while the men were distracted. Cooper opened the door, revealing Reynolds and his men arrayed in a semicircle before the cottage. Their weapons were drawn but not yet aimed directly at the door. Reynolds himself sat astride a large bay horse, looking down with undisguised contempt. Carson Morgan, he sneered. I should have known you'd crawl to your brother. Always were the weak link. Carson straightened as much as his injuries allowed. Where's Hamilton? The judge is indisposed, Reynolds replied smoothly. His wound, while not fatal, has left him temporarily unable to lead. I've assumed responsibility in his absence. Convenient, Cooper remarked. Reynolds ignored him, focusing on Carson. I'm disappointed in you, Morgan. We had a good arrangement. Your bank processed the paperwork, no questions asked. In return, you received a generous percentage. Now you've thrown it all away for what? Some misguided sense of family loyalty? Maybe I developed a conscience, Carson responded, his voice stronger than Ethan would have thought possible given his condition. Reynolds laughed harshly. A conscience? Now? After 15 years of profiting from the scheme? Don't insult my intelligence. What do you want, Reynolds? Ethan cut in. We're not giving you the documents. Oh, I think you are, Reynolds smiled coldly. You see, we have something you want. He nodded to one of his men who rode forward leading a riderless horse. Across the saddle, bound and gagged, was Eleanor Bennett. Ethan's blood ran cold. He glanced back into the cottage, where he thought Eleanor was gathering the documents with Sarah. Instead, he saw only Sarah, her face pale with shock. Eleanor must have slipped out the back, perhaps hoping to get help from town. Let her go, Reynolds, Cooper demanded. She's just an old woman. An old woman who's been a thorn in our side for 15 years, Reynolds countered, always whispering about what she saw the night Hayes died. Always just barely avoiding making a formal accusation. He patted the neck of his horse casually. We've been patient with her out of respect for her position in the community. That patience has ended. Carson leaned heavily against the doorframe. If anything happens to Eleanor, the whole town will rise against you. Perhaps, but by then we'll be long gone with the evidence. Reynolds extended his hand. The documents and the money, gentlemen, or the old woman dies, followed by everyone in that cottage. Inside, Sarah had to Ethan's side, clutching the leather satchel. Dad, she whispered, we can't let them hurt Mrs. Bennett. Ethan looked from his daughter to the elderly midwife slumped across the saddle. Eleanor had spent 15 years keeping Hayes' secret, living with the knowledge that speaking out would mean her death. Now her courage had put her directly in harm's way. We need to buy time, Cooper muttered. The townsmen I gathered last night will be assembling soon. If we can stall, they'll kill her before help arrives, Ethan replied grimly. Carson straightened suddenly, seeming to find some reserve of strength. I'll go with them, he announced. Me and the documents, in exchange for Eleanor and safe passage for the rest of you. Carson, no, Ethan began. It's the only way, brother. Carson turned to Reynolds. You get what you want. The evidence destroyed, the scheme protected. In return, you leave my brother and his daughter alone. Reynolds considered the offer, his cold eyes calculating. The strong box, too. The money stays, Carson countered. Consider it compensation for the families who were defrauded, a small portion of what was stolen from them. Always the negotiator, Reynolds smiled thinly. Very well. You and the documents for the old woman and your brother's safety. But Cooper comes with us, too. Can't have the law interfering further. Cooper started to object, but Carson cut him off. Agreed. But my brother gets written confirmation of his legal ownership of the cabin and a guarantee of safety signed by Hamilton. The judge is in no condition to sign anything, Reynolds protested. Then you sign it as his representative, Carson insisted. I know you have his seal in your saddlebag. You always were prepared for contingencies, Thomas. Reynolds' surprise at Carson's knowledge was quickly masked. As you wish. The papers for your brother, the sheriff, and the old woman released, and you accompany us with the documents. He turned to his men. Phillips, draft the ownership confirmation. Use the judge's official paper. While one of Reynolds' men dismounted and began writing, Ethan pulled Carson aside. You can't do this. They'll kill you the moment they have what they want. Probably, Carson admitted, wincing as the movement aggravated his injuries. But it's the only way to save Sarah and Eleanor. And maybe it's the right thing to do for once in my life. There has to be another way, Ethan insisted. Carson shook his head slowly. There isn't, not in time, but listen, Hamilton's office, the deed behind Washington's portrait. That's the key to everything. If you can get that, you still have a chance to bring them down. Before Ethan could respond, Reynolds called from outside. The papers are ready, Morgan. Let's conclude our business. Carson turned to Sarah, who stood holding the leather satchel, her young face a mask of worry. Take care of your father, Sarah. He needs you more than he'll ever admit. Sarah embraced her uncle gently, mindful of his injuries. Thank you for helping us, she whispered. With the exchange arranged, Reynolds' men brought Eleanor forward, while Carson, supported by Cooper, made his way painfully down the cottage steps. The elderly midwife was untied and helped toward the cottage, while the sheriff and Carson were escorted to horses waiting nearby. The documents, Reynolds demanded, extending his hand toward Sarah. She looked to her father, who nodded reluctantly. With visible reluctance, she handed over the leather satchel. Reynolds quickly examined the contents, his satisfaction evident. Good. Now, as promised. He handed Ethan the paper his man had drafted, a confirmation of ownership for the cabin and surrounding 12 acres, bearing the judge's official seal. This isn't over, Reynolds, Ethan warned quietly. Oh, I think it is, Reynolds replied with a cold smile. By the time we reach Helena, these documents will be ashes, and your brother and the sheriff will have met with an unfortunate accident in the mountains. Tragic, but these things happen to travelers. If anything happens to them, you'll what? Reynolds laughed. You're a nobody, Morgan, a failed rancher with a piece of worthless land and a daughter to feed. Be grateful you're walking away with your life. With that, Reynolds wheeled his horse around, signaling his men to move out. Cooper gave Ethan one last meaningful look, part warning, part encouragement, before being forced to ride alongside Carson, both men under heavy guard. As the riders disappeared down the road, Ethan helped Eleanor into the cottage. The elderly midwife was shaken but unharmed, her spirit still defiant despite her ordeal. They'll kill them both, she said grimly, once they were inside. Just like they killed Hayes. Not if I can help it, Ethan replied, checking his revolver. Sarah, help Mrs. Bennett. I need to get to town. What are you going to do, Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Get that railroad deed from Hamilton's office. Carson said it's the key to everything. If I can find it before Reynolds and his men get too far, we might still have leverage. The judge's office will be guarded, Eleanor warned. I'm counting on it, Ethan said grimly. Most of Hamilton's men will be with Reynolds. That leaves fewer watching the office. I'm coming with you, Sarah insisted. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than staying here alone, Sarah countered. Reynolds' men could come back, or the judge could send others when he realizes we're vulnerable. Eleanor nodded reluctantly. The girl has a point, Ethan. Nowhere is safe now. Ethan hesitated, torn between the need to protect his daughter and the recognition that she was right. Finally, he nodded. Stay close to me at all times. Do exactly as I say without question. Understood? Understood, Sarah agreed solemnly. They left Eleanor's cottage just as the sun was fully rising, casting long shadows across the valley. The town of Silver Creek was stirring to life, unaware of the drama that had unfolded through the night. Ethan took a circuitous route, avoiding the main streets, keeping to alleys and back ways. The courthouse, where Judge Hamilton kept his office, stood in the center of town, a solid stone building with white columns intended to impress and intimidate. At this early hour, only one guard was visible, a young deputy pacing lazily before the main entrance. We need a distraction, Ethan murmured, studying the building from the shadow of the livery stable across the street. Sarah tugged at his sleeve. Look, Dad, the side window is open. She was right. A small window on the building's eastern side stood partially open, presumably to catch the morning breeze. It was narrow, but perhaps wide enough for Sarah to slip through. I could go in and unlock the side door for you, she suggested, reading his thoughts. It's too risky, Ethan objected, though he was already calculating the possibility. I can do it, Sarah insisted. I'm small enough to fit, and I'll be quieter than you would. Ethan weighed their options. They needed that deed, and time was running out. Every minute that passed meant Cooper and Carson were being taken further away, closer to their inevitable execution once Reynolds had no further use for them. All right, he decided finally, but first, we need to draw the guard away from the front. Taking an old horseshoe from the livery stable, Ethan circled around to the back of the courthouse. With careful aim, he threw the horseshoe through a rear window. The crash of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet. As expected, the deputy immediately ran toward the sound, drawing his gun. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Ethan and Sarah darted across the street to the side of the courthouse. Remember, find the side door and unlock it. Ethan instructed, lifting Sarah up to the open window. Don't try to find the deed yourself. Sarah nodded, wiggling through the narrow opening with surprising agility. She disappeared inside, leaving Ethan to wait anxiously in the shadows, listening to the deputy's confused exclamations as he investigated the broken window. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Finally, the side door opened a crack, and Sarah's face appeared. All clear, she whispered. Inside, the courthouse was cool and dim, smelling of old paper and floor wax. Hamilton's office was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with portraits of previous judges. They moved silently, pausing at each doorway to listen for any sound of occupation. The judge's office was locked, but the heavy oak door proved no match for Ethan's shoulder after a lifetime of ranch work. The lock splintered with a sharp crack, and they slipped inside, closing the damaged door behind them. Hamilton's sanctum was exactly what one would expect from the most powerful man in the territory. Leather-bound law books lining the walls, a massive desk of polished mahogany, and an ornate silver inkstand that probably cost more than Ethan had earned in the past year. And there, above the fireplace, hung the portrait of George Washington that Carson had mentioned. Keep watch at the door, Ethan instructed, crossing to the portrait. The painting was heavier than it looked, secured to the wall with substantial hooks. Behind it, just as Carson had described, was a small wall safe. This presented a more significant challenge. Can you open it? Sarah asked, glancing nervously toward the hallway. Not without the combination, Ethan admitted, examining the dial. But safes like this often have weaknesses. Years of ranch work had given Ethan an intuitive understanding of mechanics. He pressed his ear to the safe, turning the dial slowly, listening for the subtle clicks that might betray the combination. It was a skill he'd learned from an old ranch hand who'd had a colorful past before settling into honest work. After several tense minutes, the safe door swung open with a satisfying click. Inside lay several documents, including one tied with a red ribbon and bearing the seal of the Northern Pacific Railroad. This must be it, Ethan said, carefully removing the document. He unrolled it on Hamilton's desk, revealing an elaborate land grant for the railroad's right-of-way through the territory. The signatures at the bottom included those of the territorial governor, Judge Hamilton, and several officials from Washington. What makes this so important? Sarah wondered, studying the document. Ethan scanned the text, looking for anything unusual. Then he saw it, a discrepancy in the dates. The grant was dated 1880, but a reference survey was dated 1881. The railroad had been granted land based on a survey that hadn't yet been conducted. This proves the entire grant was fraudulent, Ethan realized. They created the documentation after the fact, probably to legitimize land they'd already seized from rightful owners. Is that why they killed Mr. Hayes? He must have discovered this discrepancy and confronted them. Ethan carefully re-rolled the document. With this and his other evidence, he could have exposed the entire scheme. A sound from the hallway froze them both. Footsteps, heavy and purposeful, ascending the stairs. Ethan quickly closed the safe and rehung Washington's portrait, then guided Sarah behind the large desk. The footsteps stopped outside the office door, a knock, then a voice. Judge Hamilton, are you there, sir? Ethan signaled for Sarah to remain silent. After a moment, the doorknob turned. The damaged lock gave way, and the door swung open to reveal one of Hamilton's clerks, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers. He started violently at the sight of Ethan. Mr. Morgan, what are you... The clerk's eyes widened as he noticed the railroad deed in Ethan's hand. You can't take that. It's official property of the court. It's evidence of fraud, Ethan corrected, advancing on the terrified clerk. And I'm taking it to the federal marshal in Helena. The clerk backed away, then turned to flee. Ethan lunged, catching him by the collar and dragging him back into the office. With quick movements, he bound and gagged the young man using curtain cords, then secured him to Hamilton's heavy chair. He'll be found soon, Ethan told Sarah, pocketing the deed. We need to move quickly. They exited through a back staircase, emerging into an alley behind the courthouse. The town was fully awake now, merchants opening their shops, miners heading to the saloons after night shifts. Ethan led Sarah through back streets toward the livery stable, where they could secure horses for the journey ahead. As they approached the stable, a familiar figure stepped out to meet them. Eleanor Bennett, looking far more composed than when they'd left her at the cottage, held the reins of two saddled horses. Thought you might need these, she said with a knowing smile. The bay is the fastest in the stable. The Pinto is steady and sure-footed, good for mountain trails. How did you know? Ethan asked, taking the reins. I've been watching this town for 15 years, young man. I know when someone's about to make a desperate ride. Eleanor handed him a small bundle. Food, water, and a little something for pain. Your brother will need it when you find him. Thank you, Ethan said, genuinely moved by the old woman's foresight. What about you? Reynolds' men might return. Don't worry about me. Once you're gone, I'm gathering the townswomen. By nightfall, half the territory will know what Hamilton and the governor have been doing. Eleanor's eyes gleamed with determination. We may be denied the vote, Mr. Morgan, but never underestimate the power of women with a story to tell. With Sarah mounted on the Pinto and the railroad deed secure inside his coat, Ethan took one last look at Silver Creek. In just 24 hours, his life had been completely upended, from a desperate man with nothing to his name but 25 cents, to someone holding the key to exposing corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. Which way would Reynolds have taken them? He asked Eleanor. North Trail toward Helena, she replied confidently. But they'll avoid the main road. Too many travelers who might witness something they shouldn't. Try the old logging route through Blackwater Canyon. It's longer, but more isolated. Ethan nodded his thanks, then turned to Sarah. Ready? His daughter sat straight in the saddle, her young face set with determination that reminded him so much of her mother. Ready, Dad. With a final nod to Eleanor, they spurred their horses forward, racing against time to save Carson and Cooper before Reynolds could carry out his deadly plans. The old logging route through Blackwater Canyon was as Eleanor had described. Isolated and challenging, winding between steep rock walls and across fast-moving streams swollen with spring melt. Ethan and Sarah rode hard, pushing their mounts as much as they dared on the treacherous terrain. Every minute counted if they were to catch up with Reynolds and his men. By midday, they had reached a vantage point overlooking much of the canyon. Ethan reined in his horse, scanning the trail ahead with a small spyglass he carried from his army days. In the distance, he could make out a group of riders moving slowly through a narrow pass. That's them, he confirmed, passing the glass to Sarah. About a dozen men with Carson and Cooper in the middle. They're moving slowly, Sarah observed. Maybe because of Uncle Carson's injuries? More likely they're in no hurry, Ethan replied grimly. They think they have all the time in the world. They continued forward, maintaining a cautious distance. The canyon narrowed further ahead, forcing Reynolds' party to ride single file through a passage barely wide enough for a horse. This would be their best opportunity. Here's what we'll do, Ethan explained, as they dismounted in a sheltered grove. There's a ridge above that narrow passage. I can position myself there without a clear view of the entire party. What about me? Sarah asked. You'll stay with the horses, out of sight. Seeing her begin to protest, he added firmly, This isn't negotiable, Sarah. If something goes wrong, you take that railroad deed and ride for Helena as fast as you can. Find Marshal Davis. Tell him everything. Sarah reluctantly agreed, though her expression made it clear she wasn't happy about being left behind. Ethan made his way up the rocky slope to the ridge overlooking the passage. The climb was challenging, requiring him to find handholds in the crumbling rock face. By the time he reached a suitable position, his hands were scraped and his breathing labored. But he had an excellent vantage point. Reynolds' party was approaching the narrow passage, still unaware of his presence. Through his spyglass, Ethan could see Carson slumped in his saddle, clearly struggling to remain upright. Cooper rode beside him, his hands bound, but his expression alert, constantly scanning their surroundings. Ethan considered his options. He had his revolver and a rifle borrowed from Eleanor's cottage, but even with the element of surprise, he couldn't hope to overcome a dozen armed men. He needed to create a diversion, something that would scatter the party and give him a chance to free Carson and Cooper. The answer came in the form of nature itself. The spring melt had left the canyon walls unstable, with loose rocks perched precariously above the trail. A well-placed shot might trigger a small avalanche, enough to create confusion without causing serious harm. Ethan positioned himself carefully, taking aim at a collection of rocks directly above the trail, but ahead of where Reynolds' men would be riding. He would need to time it perfectly. Too soon, and they would simply wait for the debris to settle. Too late, and someone could be injured or killed. He watched through the spyglass as the first riders entered the narrow passage. Reynolds himself led the way, followed by two of his men. Then came Carson and Cooper, still under close guard. The remaining men brought up the rear, creating a perfect target. Ethan took careful aim, drawing a deep breath to steady his hand. He squeezed the trigger, the rifle's report echoing dramatically through the canyon. His shot struck exactly where he intended, dislodging a shower of rocks and debris that cascaded down onto the trail ahead of Reynolds. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Horses reared in panic, riders shouted in confusion, and for a crucial moment, all attention was directed away from Carson and Cooper. Ethan fired again, this time aiming at the ground near the trailing riders, creating the impression of multiple attackers. Through the chaos, he saw Cooper react instantly, understanding the opportunity. Despite his bound hands, the sheriff managed to slide from his horse and pull Carson down with him. They disappeared from view behind a large boulder as Reynolds and his men scrambled for cover, drawing weapons and firing blindly at the canyon walls. Ethan worked his way quickly along the ridge, using the confusion to change position without being spotted. He needed to reach Cooper and Carson before Reynolds' men regrouped. The descent was treacherous, loose stones sliding beneath his feet, threatening to send him tumbling down the steep slope. Halfway down, a bullet struck the rock near his head, showering him with stone fragments. Reynolds' men had spotted him. Ethan pressed himself against the canyon wall, returning fire to keep them pinned down while continuing his descent. He finally reached the canyon floor some 30 yards from where he'd last seen Cooper and Carson. Crouching behind rocks, he worked his way toward them, using the continuing gunfire as cover. He found them huddled behind a large boulder, Cooper working frantically to free his hands from their bonds using a sharp edge of stone. "You took your time," Cooper remarked dryly as Ethan joined them. "Traffic was heavy," Ethan replied, quickly cutting the sheriff's bonds with his knife. "Can Carson ride?" "Barely," Cooper assessed, glancing at the banker who was pale and sweating, but conscious. "But he won't last long in a chase." "We won't need to outrun them," Ethan said, producing the railroad deed from inside his coat. "We have what we need now." Cooper's eyes widened as he recognized the document. "Is that—" "The fraudulent railroad grant," Ethan confirmed. "With this and Hayes' evidence, we can bring down Hamilton, Reynolds, and the governor. Which is why we can't let you leave with it," came Reynolds' voice from behind them. They turned to find Thomas Reynolds standing just yards away, revolver aimed steadily at Ethan's chest. Two of his men flanked him, their rifles ready. "Drop your weapons," Reynolds ordered. "Now!" Ethan carefully set down his rifle, raising his hand slowly. Cooper, unarmed, did the same. Carson remained slumped against the boulder, barely conscious. "The deed as well," Reynolds added, gesturing with his gun. "On the ground. If you kill us, the whole territory will know what happened," Ethan warned, making no move to surrender the document. "Eleanor Bennett is spreading the word even now. An old woman's gossip against the word of a territorial judge and the governor?" Reynolds laughed coldly. "Who do you think people will believe?" "They'll believe this," came Sarah's voice. All heads turned to see Sarah standing on a rock outcropping above them, Hayes' leather satchel held high. "I have all of Mr. Hayes' evidence right here. Every fake deed, every letter, every record of payment." Reynolds' face contorted with rage. "The girl! Get her!" His men hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of shooting a child. In that moment of uncertainty, Ethan made his move. He lunged forward, tackling Reynolds before the man could aim at Sarah. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the revolver discharging harmlessly into the air. Cooper seized the opportunity, grabbing one of the rifles and leveling it at Reynolds' men. "Drop them," he ordered in his sheriff's voice. "Now." Outflanked and outmaneuvered, the men complied, lowering their weapons. Ethan pinned Reynolds to the ground, the deed still secure in his inside pocket. "It's over, Thomas," he said quietly. "You've lost." "You're a fool, Morgan," Reynolds spat. "Do you have any idea what this will do to the territory? The railroad will pull out. The mines will close. Thousands will lose their livelihoods. All so you can claim some moral victory?" "Justice isn't always simple," Ethan acknowledged, echoing Eleanor's words from earlier. "But it's still justice." With Reynolds and his men disarmed, Cooper quickly took charge, organizing them into a line while Ethan checked on Carson. His brother was fading fast, the ordeal having taken a severe toll on his already weakened condition. "Did we win?" Carson asked weakly as Ethan knelt beside him. We did, Ethan confirmed, gripping his brother's hand. Thanks to you. That deed was exactly where you said it would be. Carson managed a faint smile. Always did have a good memory for hiding places. Remember when we were boys? The fishing hole? Where we hid Dad's whiskey bottle after sampling it, Ethan finished, smiling at the memory. He never did find it. Ethan, Carson's voice grew serious, his breathing labored. I'm sorry for everything. The bank, the ranch. I should have helped you. Save your strength, Ethan urged. We'll get you to a doctor in Helena. Carson shook his head slightly. Too late for that. Just promise me something. Make it right for all those people who lost their land. Use Hayes's money. Help them. I promise, Ethan said solemnly. Sarah had joined them, kneeling on Carson's other side. Uncle Carson, you have to hold on. Please. Carson looked at her with obvious affection. You look just like your mother, you know. Same spirit, same courage. His eyes shifted back to Ethan. You did good, brother. With her. With everything. Cooper approached, his expression grave. We need to move. More of Reynolds' men could be nearby. With Carson secured as comfortably as possible on his horse, they began the journey back to Silver Creek. Reynolds and his men were bound and forced to walk, under Cooper's watchful eye. The return trip was slower, made more difficult by Carson's deteriorating condition and the need to guard their prisoners. They were met at the edge of town by a remarkable sight. Dozens of townspeople lining the main street, many of them armed. Eleanor Bennett stood at their head, her white hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. Word travels fast, Cooper observed with a small smile. Judge Hamilton was waiting on the courthouse steps, his arm in a sling from Ethan's bullet. His usual imposing presence was diminished, his face gray with pain and the knowledge of his impending downfall. This changes nothing, Morgan, he called as Ethan rode past. The governor will never allow this to reach a federal court. Ethan reined in his horse, turning to face the judge. It already has, he replied, nodding toward the far end of the street. A group of riders was approaching, uniformed men led by a stern-faced individual Ethan recognized as U.S. Marshal James Davis. Eleanor's messages had reached Helena faster than anyone could have anticipated. Hamilton's face crumpled as he realized the full extent of his defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the courthouse, his shoulders slumped in resignation. The marshal dismounted before Ethan, tipping his hat respectfully. Mr. Morgan, Sheriff Cooper, I understand you have evidence regarding land fraud in this territory? Ethan handed over the railroad deed and Hayes' satchel of documents. Everything you need to bring down the corrupt officials who've been stealing from honest settlers for 15 years. Davis examined the materials quickly, his expression hardening. This will cause quite a stir in the capital. Governor Wilson has powerful friends. But the law is the law, Cooper observed. Isn't that right, Marshal? Indeed it is, Sheriff. Davis signaled to his deputies. Secure the judge and Mr. Reynolds. We'll be taking them back to Helena for formal charges. As the marshal's men took custody of the prisoners, Ethan turned his attention back to Carson, who had fallen unconscious during the final miles of their journey. With help from several townsmen, they carried him to Dr. Matthews' small clinic on the edge of town. The doctor's assessment was grim, but not hopeless. Internal bleeding, several broken ribs, possible damage to his liver. I'll do what I can, but he needs more than I can provide here. Will he survive long enough to reach Helena? Ethan asked. If we leave immediately and travel carefully, he might have a chance, the doctor replied. The hospital there has surgeons with experience in these kinds of injuries. The decision was made quickly. Carson would be transported to Helena in a wagon specially outfitted by Dr. Matthews, accompanied by the doctor himself and one of the marshal's deputies. Ethan wanted to go as well, but there was another matter that required his attention first. The strong box containing Hayes' blackmail money, $8,000 in cash and gold, sat in Cooper's office, its fate undetermined. As Carson had requested, Ethan intended to use it to help those who had been defrauded by Hamilton's scheme. A restitution fund, he proposed to Cooper and Eleanor as they sat in the sheriff's office that evening, for families who lost their savings to fake land deals. It won't come close to covering everyone's losses, Cooper cautioned. Not if the fraud was as widespread as Hayes' documents suggest. It's a start, Eleanor said firmly. And once word gets out that Governor Wilson and Judge Hamilton are facing federal charges, others may come forward with additional evidence. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet since their return to town, suddenly spoke up. What about our cabin? Will we get to keep it? Ethan smiled at his daughter, realizing that amid all the drama and danger, they had almost forgotten the simple home that had started this entire adventure. Yes, sweetheart, the cabin is ours, 25 cents, fair and square. The best 25 cents ever spent, Cooper remarked with a wry smile, though I'm not sure I'd call anything about this experience fair or square. As night fell over Silver Creek, Ethan stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching as Marshal Davis and his men prepared to depart with their prisoners. Judge Hamilton sat stone-faced in a prison wagon, his judicial robes exchanged for simple traveling clothes. Beside him, Thomas Reynolds stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the townspeople who had gathered to witness his disgrace. Sarah joined her father on the porch, slipping her small hand into his. Will Uncle Carson be all right? I hope so, Ethan replied honestly. He's tough, like all Morgans. Is it really over now? All the bad things? Ethan considered the question carefully. The corruption they had uncovered went deep, involving powerful people who wouldn't surrender their positions easily. The railroad's fraudulent land claim would have repercussions throughout the territory, and there would inevitably be those who resented the disruption to the status quo, even if that status quo had been built on theft and murder. Not entirely, he admitted, but we've made a start. Sometimes that's all you can do, make a start and trust that others will carry on the work. As if to emphasize his point, Eleanor Bennett approached, accompanied by several other townswomen. Each carried a stack of papers, copies of Hayes's evidence that they had spent the afternoon transcribing. We're sending these to every newspaper in the territory, Eleanor explained. By this time next week, everyone from Billings to Bozeman will know what Hamilton and Wilson have been doing. Ethan nodded his approval. Hayes would be proud. He died trying to expose the truth. Now you're finishing what he started. Eleanor's weathered face softened. And you, Mr. Morgan? What will you do now? Ethan looked down at Sarah, then out toward the north, where Crow's Ridge was visible in the fading light. We have a cabin to fix up, land to work, a future to build. A future that started with 25 cents, Sarah added with a smile. The best investment I ever made, Ethan agreed, squeezing her hand gently. As they watched Marshal Davis and his prisoners depart, followed by the wagon carrying Carson to what they all hoped would be life-saving treatment in Helena, Ethan felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. In just 2 days, his life had transformed completely. From a desperate man with nothing to his name but a broken pocket watch, to someone who had helped expose corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. And it had all begun with 25 cents in a sealed section of floor that no one dared to open. The Montana summer arrived with stunning swiftness, transforming the landscape around Crow's Ridge. Fields that had been dull and dormant now flourished with wild grasses and wildflowers. The forest surrounding the cabin teemed with life. Deer browsing at dawn, hawks circling lazily overhead, and occasionally a black bear ambling through the distant tree line. 3 months had passed since the dramatic events that had exposed corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. 3 months of healing, rebuilding, and coming to terms with all that had happened. Ethan stood on the newly rebuilt porch of the cabin, surveying the improvements they had made. The sagging roof had been replaced, the windows reglazed and properly framed. A small corral now stood to the west, home to their mare and 2 young colts purchased with a small portion of the Hayes restitution fund. To the east, Sarah's garden flourished, rows of vegetables stretching toward the morning sun. Inside, the cabin had been transformed as well. The infamous sealed floor was gone, replaced with sturdy oak planks. The walls had been chinked with fresh clay and whitewashed. Shelves lined one wall, holding Sarah's growing collection of books, gifts from Eleanor Bennett and other townspeople grateful for what the Morgans had done. "Dad," Sarah called from the edge of the property. "Riders coming." Ethan shaded his eyes, making out 3 figures approaching along the main trail. The lead rider was unmistakable. Sheriff Nathan Cooper, his badge glinting in the sunlight. Beside him rode Eleanor Bennett, sitting straight-backed on a gentle gray mare. The third rider made Ethan's heart leap. Carson Morgan, looking thin but upright in the saddle. "Uncle Carson!" Sarah raced down the path to meet them, her braids flying behind her. Ethan followed at a more measured pace, watching as his brother carefully dismounted. Carson moved gingerly, clearly still recovering from his injuries, but the improvement was remarkable. When he'd left for Helena 3 months ago, the doctors had given him slim chances of survival. Now here he stood, smiling as Sarah embraced him carefully. "Easy there, niece," Carson laughed softly. "I'm still held together mostly by doctors' stitches and stubbornness." "How are you feeling?" Ethan asked, clasping his brother's hand warmly. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," Carson admitted. "But the doctors in Helena say I'm something of a miracle. Not many men survive the kind of internal injuries I had." He glanced around at the property, his expression appreciative. "You've been busy. This place looks completely different." "Sarah and I have had plenty of help," Ethan acknowledged. "Seems like half the town has shown up at one point or another with tools or supplies." "You two are heroes in Silver Creek," Eleanor explained, accepting Ethan's help down from her horse. "Everyone wants to be part of your story now." Cooper dismounted, stretching his tall frame. "I brought news from Helena. Thought you'd want to hear it in person." "Good or bad?" Ethan asked, leading the group toward the cabin. "Some of both," Cooper replied. "Judge Hamilton has been formally indicted on charges of corruption, fraud, and accessory to murder. Reynolds, too. Their trial is set for September." "And Governor Wilson?" Ethan asked as they settled on the porch. Sarah had gone inside to prepare coffee and bring out the apple pie she'd baked that morning. Cooper's expression darkened. "That's the less positive news. Wilson resigned rather than face impeachment, but there's talk he struck a deal with federal authorities. Limited immunity in exchange for testimony against some very powerful people back east who were financing the land scheme." "So he walks free?" Ethan couldn't keep the anger from his voice. "Not entirely free," Carson interjected. "He's ruined politically, his reputation is destroyed, and he's been forced to surrender most of his personal fortune, much of which came from the fraud. That money, along with what we recovered from Hayes' strongbox, has been added to the restitution fund," Cooper added. "It's grown to nearly $20,000. The territorial court has appointed a commission to identify victims of the fraud and distribute appropriate compensation." Sarah emerged with a tray bearing coffee and 5 plates of pie. "I heard what you said about the governor," she said, setting the tray on the small table Ethan had built. "It doesn't seem fair that he gets to avoid prison when he ordered Mr. Hayes killed." Eleanor patted Sarah's hand gently. "Life isn't always fair, child, but justice takes many forms. Sometimes seeing the powerful brought low, their schemes exposed to the light of day, is its own kind of justice." They ate Sarah's pie, which drew genuine praise from all, and caught up on other news. The Northern Pacific Railroad was renegotiating its land grants through proper legal channels. Thomas Reynolds' businesses had been seized and would be auctioned to help fund restitution. Several of Hamilton's associates had fled the territory, but most had been apprehended by U.S. Marshals. "What about you, Carson?" Ethan asked as they finished their coffee. "The doctors may call you a miracle, but you're not fully recovered yet. What are your plans?" Carson set down his cup carefully. "That's actually one reason I came today. I've been offered a position with the Territorial Banking Commission. They're establishing new regulations to prevent the kind of fraud that happened here. They want someone who understands how the schemes worked." "And who better than someone who participated in them?" Ethan observed without rancor. "Exactly," Carson nodded. "I know all the tricks, all the ways the books were falsified. I can help make sure it doesn't happen again." He hesitated, then added, "It's in Helena. I'd be moving there permanently." "Good for you," Ethan said sincerely. "A fresh start." "What about the Silver Creek Bank?" Sarah asked. "Will it close?" "No," Cooper answered. "The territorial court has appointed a temporary manager. Eventually, it will be sold to new owners with clean reputations." Carson looked around the property again, his expression wistful. "You've done remarkable things with this place in just 3 months. By this time next year, you could have a proper ranch running." "That's the plan," Ethan confirmed. "We've already got offers from the mining companies to supply beef. Good money if we can build up a decent herd." "Which brings me to my other reason for visiting," Carson said, reaching into his coat. He withdrew an envelope and handed it to Ethan. "This is for you. or rather, for Sarah. Ethan opened the envelope, finding a bank draft for $5,000. He looked up sharply. "What's this?" "My personal restitution," Carson explained. "I've surrendered most of my assets to the territorial court for the general fund, but this came from our father's original investment in the bank, legitimate money that predated the fraud. The court agreed it should remain in the Morgan family." He smiled at Sarah. "I'm setting it up as a trust for Sarah's future, for education or a dowry, or to expand this ranch when she's older." "Uncle Carson, that's so generous," Sarah exclaimed. "It's the least I can do," Carson replied, his voice thick with emotion. "When I think of how I treated you both, denying you a loan when you needed it most, looking down on you from my banker's office." He broke off, struggling to maintain his composure. "That's in the past," Ethan said firmly. "We all have regrets. What matters is what we do now." Eleanor, who had been quietly observing the brothers' reconciliation, spoke up. "Speaking of what we do now, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you, Ethan." "What's that, Mrs. Bennett?" "Joseph Hayes," she said simply. "It's been 15 years since he was murdered for trying to expose the truth. His body lies in an unmarked grave on the edge of the cemetery. Now that the truth is known, it seems fitting that he should be properly honored." Ethan nodded slowly. "You're right. Without Hayes's evidence, none of this would have come to light. He died trying to do the right thing, even if his methods were complicated." "The town council has approved a proper memorial," Cooper added. "But we thought you might want to be involved, given your connection to the whole affair." "I'd be honored," Ethan said. "When were you thinking?" "Next Sunday," Eleanor replied. "We've located Hayes' sister in St. Louis. She's traveling here for the ceremony." The conversation turned to plans for the memorial, then drifted to other topics. The summer cattle prices, the progress of Sarah's education under Eleanor's tutoring, the latest news from other parts of the territory. As the afternoon waned, Carson began showing signs of fatigue, the long ride having taxed his still recovering body. "We should head back to town," Cooper observed, rising from his chair. "Carson needs rest, and I have evening rounds to make." As they prepared to leave, Carson drew Ethan aside. "There's one more thing I haven't told you," he said quietly. "Something I learned in Helena while I was recovering." "What's that?" "Governor Wilson wasn't the highest-ranking official involved in the land fraud." Carson glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. There were senators, possibly even cabinet members in Washington who profited from the scheme. Hayes had begun to trace those connections before he was killed. Ethan felt a chill despite the summer warmth. "Are you saying this goes all the way to the federal government?" "I'm saying be careful," Carson warned. "What you and Sarah did here was remarkable, but it may have disturbed more powerful interests than you realize. The railroad alone has allies throughout the government. They won't take kindly to having their land grants scrutinized." "Are we in danger?" Carson considered the question carefully. "Not immediately, I don't think. The scandal is too public now, the evidence too widely distributed. But in the long term, keep your eyes open. Trust Cooper. Trust Eleanor. Be wary of strangers showing too much interest in what happened here." Ethan nodded, troubled by this new information, but determined not to let it overshadow the progress they had made. "I appreciate the warning. We'll be careful." They rejoined the others, the brothers embracing carefully before Carson mounted his horse. As the three riders departed, Sarah came to stand beside her father, waving until they disappeared around the bend. "Uncle Carson seems much better," she observed. "Almost like his old self, but kinder somehow." "Near-death experiences you have a way of changing a person," Ethan replied, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Come on, we've still got chores to finish before dark." The following Sunday, the entire town of Silver Creek gathered at the cemetery for Joseph Hayes' memorial. A proper headstone had been erected, bearing his name, dates, and the simple inscription, "Seeker of Truth, Champion of Justice." Hayes' sister, a dignified woman in her 50s, stood beside the grave accepting condolences from townspeople who had known her brother. Ethan and Sarah arrived early, bringing wildflowers from their property to place on the grave. Eleanor had told them that Hayes had been fond of botany, often collecting specimens during his travels around the territory. The ceremony was simple but powerful. The new territorial judge, a solemn man named William Harrington, spoke of Hayes' courage and determination. Eleanor Bennett shared memories of the journalist's kindness and curiosity. Cooper read passages from some of Hayes's published articles, revealing a keen mind and compassionate heart. When it came time for Ethan to speak, he found himself unexpectedly emotional. "I never knew Joseph Hayes," he began, standing before the assembled crowd. "But in a strange way, he changed my life. His determination to expose the truth, even at great personal risk, set in motion events that brought my daughter and me to Silver Creek. It led to our purchase of a certain cabin for 25 cents. This brought a ripple of knowing laughter from the townspeople. What Hayes discovered in that cabin, what he died protecting, has now brought justice to many who were wronged. It has exposed corruption at the highest levels of our territory. It has begun the process of healing and restitution." Ethan glanced at Hayes' sister, who was listening intently, tears in her eyes. "I wish I could have known the man who showed such courage. All I can do now is promise that his sacrifice was not in vain. The truth he sought is now known. The justice he championed is being served." After the ceremony, Hayes' sister approached Ethan and Sarah. "Thank you for what you said," she told Ethan, clasping his hand warmly. "And thank you, both of you, for finishing what my brother started. He would have liked you, I think." "We're honored to have played a part in bringing the truth to light," Ethan replied. "Your brother was a brave man." "Stubborn too," she smiled sadly. "Our father always said Joseph would either change the world or get himself killed trying. In the end, I suppose he did both." Later that afternoon, as Ethan and Sarah rode back to their cabin, they passed the spot where Hayes had been murdered 15 years earlier. Eleanor had shown it to them, a bend in the road where the journalist had been ambushed by Judge Hamilton. They paused there briefly, paying silent respect to the man whose work they had unwittingly continued. "Dad," Sarah said as they resumed their journey, "do you think we're still in danger? Because of what we found?" Ethan considered how to answer, remembering Carson's warning about powerful interests in Washington. "I think we need to be cautious," he said finally. "What happened here threatens some very influential people. Not just Hamilton and Reynolds, but others we may never even meet." "But the truth is out now," Sarah pointed out. "Everyone knows about the fraud." "Yes, but revealing corruption often means making powerful enemies." Ethan glanced at his daughter, hating to burden her with such concerns, but respecting her too much to hide the reality. "We'll be careful. Cooper and his deputies will keep an eye on things. And we have friends in town now, people who owe us their gratitude for exposing the fraud." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "We can't live in fear, though. That would mean they still have power over us." Ethan smiled at his daughter's wisdom, so beyond her years. "You're right, sweetheart. We'll be vigilant, but not fearful. We'll build our home, raise our cattle, and live our lives with our eyes open." They crested the final ridge, their cabin coming into view below. The late afternoon sun bathed it in golden light, making it look almost like a painting. The small log structure with its new roof, the corral with their horses, the garden with its neat rows, all set against the backdrop of Montana's endless sky. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "Our home. All thanks to 25 cents, Ethan remarked with a smile. "And a sealed floor that no one dared to open," Sarah added. As they approached the cabin, Ethan noticed something unexpected. A wagon parked near their corral. A man in a city suit stood beside it, examining their property with obvious interest. Ethan immediately tensed, Carson's warning fresh in his mind. "Stay behind me," he instructed Sarah quietly, one hand moving to the revolver at his hip. As they drew closer, the stranger turned and raised his hand in greeting. "Mr. Morgan? Ethan Morgan?" he called out. "Who's asking?" Ethan replied cautiously, keeping Sarah partially shielded behind him. "Albert Chambers, sir, from the Department of Justice in Washington." The man approached, removing his hat respectfully. He was middle-aged with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes. "I've been sent to discuss the Hayes evidence and its implications." Ethan dismounted slowly, helping Sarah down as well, but keeping himself between her and the stranger. "Cooper didn't mention any federal agents coming to town." "I only arrived yesterday," Chambers explained. "Sheriff Cooper suggested I might find you here." He reached into his coat, causing Ethan to tense further, but produced only an official-looking document bearing the Department of Justice seal. "My credentials, sir." Ethan examined the papers carefully. They appeared genuine, identifying Albert Chambers as a special investigator for the Department of Justice. assigned to investigate land fraud in the Montana Territory. "What exactly do you want from us, Mr. Chambers?" Ethan asked, still wary. "The Hayes evidence has been turned over to the territorial court." "Yes, but the implications extend far beyond Montana," Chambers replied. "Similar fraud schemes have been uncovered in Wyoming, Dakota, and parts of Colorado. We believe they are all connected, part of a larger conspiracy involving railroad interests and certain members of Congress." Sarah had moved to stand beside her father, her natural curiosity overcoming her initial caution. "Are you going to arrest more people? Like the governor?" Chambers smiled at her directness. "That's the hope, young lady. Men like Governor Wilson are just middle-level players in a much larger game. We're after the orchestrators, the men in Washington who created the system that allows such fraud to flourish." Ethan studied the man carefully, trying to determine if he represented a genuine investigation or something more sinister. Carson's warning echoed in his mind, but Chambers seemed sincere in his purpose. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," Ethan suggested, gesturing toward the cabin. "Sarah, would you put on some coffee for our guest?" As they settled at the cabin's small table, Chambers laid out the scope of his investigation. The land fraud in Montana was part of a pattern that stretched across the Western Territories. Railroad companies, in collusion with territorial officials and certain congressmen, had systematically manipulated land grants for enormous profit. Hayes was one of the first to connect the dots, Chambers explained. His notes mentioned correspondence with journalists in other territories who were noticing similar patterns. Unfortunately, several of those journalists also met with suspicious accidents or sudden illnesses. "You're saying Hayes wasn't the only one killed to protect this scheme?" Ethan asked. "We've identified at least 5 suspicious deaths across the Western Territories, all involving newspapermen or land office clerks who were asking uncomfortable questions." Chambers accepted the coffee Sarah offered with a nod of thanks. "What makes the Hayes case unique is that he managed to preserve his evidence before he was killed. And that evidence led you here," Ethan observed. "Precisely." Chambers sipped his coffee. "The department has been aware of these frauds for some time, but lacked the concrete evidence needed to bring charges against high-ranking officials. Hayes's documents, combined with the railroad deed you recovered from Judge Hamilton's office, provide that evidence." "So what happens now?" Ethan asked. "Now we build our case," Chambers replied. "I'd like to interview you both about what you discovered, how you came to possess the Hayes documents, and everything that transpired afterward. Your testimony could be crucial in the federal prosecution." Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "Will we have to go to Washington?" Chambers smiled at her enthusiasm. "Possibly, young lady. If the case proceeds to federal court, both you and your father might be called as witnesses." They spent the next several hours going over the events of the past months in meticulous detail. Chambers took copious notes, particularly interested in the railroad deed and Hamilton's reaction when he realized Ethan had taken it. As evening approached, Ethan invited the investigator to stay for dinner. Sarah had prepared a rabbit stew that filled the cabin with savory aromas. During the meal, their conversation turned to more personal matters. "If you don't mind my asking," Chambers said, "what made you bid on that cabin in the first place? From what I understand, everyone in town knew about its history." "We didn't," Ethan explained. "We were newcomers, desperate for a place of our own after losing our ranch to drought. The cabin seemed like an incredible bargain, 12 acres with a structure for 20 cents. 25 cents, Sarah corrected seriously. "Dad raised his own bid." Chambers laughed. "The best quarter ever spent, I'd say, though it brought considerable danger with it." "Worth every bit of that danger," Ethan said firmly. "Not just for exposing the fraud, but for giving us this." He gestured around the cabin at the home they had created from virtually nothing. After dinner, Chambers gathered his notes and prepared to leave. "I'll be in Silver Creek for another week, conducting additional interviews. After that, I return to Washington to present my findings to the Attorney General." "What do you think will happen?" Ethan asked, walking the investigator to his wagon. Chambers considered the question carefully. "Best case, federal indictments against several congressmen, possibly a railroad executive or two. Worst case, political pressure forces the investigation to focus solely on territorial officials like Hamilton, leaving the true architects of the scheme untouched." "Politics," Ethan said with distaste. "Indeed," Chambers agreed. "But take heart, Mr. Morgan. What you and your daughter accomplished here has already brought more justice than many ever expected to see. The people who lost their land and savings to this fraud will receive restitution. That alone is a significant victory. As Chambers drove away into the gathering dusk, Sarah joined her father outside. "Do you believe him?" she asked perceptively. "About wanting to prosecute the people in Washington?" "I believe he does," Ethan replied thoughtfully. "Whether he'll be allowed to is another question entirely." Over the following weeks, life at the Morgan cabin settled into a pleasant routine. The garden flourished under Sarah's care, yielding more vegetables than they could eat. Ethan had begun fencing the western section of their property in preparation for expanding their small herd. Each day brought visible progress, transforming the once neglected cabin into a thriving homestead. News from town arrived regularly, carried by Cooper during his weekly visits or by Eleanor, who had taken to riding out twice a week to continue Sarah's education. The Hayes Memorial had inspired others who had been cheated to come forward with their stories. The Restitution Commission was overwhelmed with claims, each one representing a family that had lost savings or land to Hamilton's schemes. Carson wrote from Helena, reporting that his health continued to improve and his work with the Banking Commission was proving both challenging and rewarding. He had met with Chambers several times, providing detailed testimony about the banking aspects of the fraud. One bright September morning, as Ethan was repairing a section of corral fence, a rider approached from the direction of town. He recognized Cooper's tall figure long before the sheriff reached the cabin. "Morning, Nathan," Ethan called, setting aside his tools. "You're out early today." Cooper dismounted, his expression unusually solemn. "Got news from Helena. Thought you should hear it from me." Sarah had emerged from the garden, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is it about Uncle Carson?" "No, your uncle's fine," Cooper assured her quickly. "It's about the federal investigation. Chambers sent word by telegraph yesterday." "Come inside," Ethan invited, sensing from Cooper's demeanor that the news wasn't entirely positive. Once they were seated at the table, Cooper delivered his message. "The Justice Department has indicted Judge Hamilton and Thomas Reynolds on federal charges of fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. Former Governor Wilson has been indicted as well, though on lesser charges due to his cooperation." "That sounds like good news," Sarah observed cautiously. "Isn't it?" Cooper sighed heavily. "It is as far as it goes, but Chambers also reported that the investigation into connections in Washington has been restricted. Certain senators applied pressure to limit the scope to territorial officials only. So the real powers behind the scheme walk free," Ethan concluded grimly. "For now," Cooper acknowledged, "Chambers hasn't given up. He's continuing to build his case privately, gathering evidence where he can. But officially, the investigation stops at the territorial level." Ethan wasn't surprised, given Carson's warnings and Chambers' own cautious predictions. Still, the confirmation that politics would protect the truly powerful left a bitter taste. "What about the railroad deed?" he asked. "The one that proved the Northern Pacific's claim was fraudulent?" "Being reviewed by a special congressional committee," Cooper replied, his tone making clear what he thought of that process. "Chambers believes it will eventually be quietly validated to avoid disrupting development along the rail line." "So they just rewrite history," Ethan said disgustedly. "Make the fraud legal after the fact." "Welcome to politics," Cooper said dryly. "But there is some genuine good news. The restitution fund has been formally established with the $20,000 recovered from Hayes' strongbox and Wilson's assets. Distribution will begin next month. Many families who lost everything will at least get something back." Sarah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Mr. Hayes would be happy about that part, I think. Even if all the bad men don't go to jail." Cooper smiled at her insight. "I think you're right, Sarah. Hayes was passionate about helping ordinary people stand up against the powerful. The restitution fund does exactly that." After Cooper departed, Ethan found himself dwelling on the news. Part of him had expected this outcome, yet he still felt disappointed that the full extent of the conspiracy would likely never be exposed. He was still lost in these thoughts when Sarah approached him later that afternoon. "Dad," she said, holding a piece of paper, "I've been thinking about what Sheriff Cooper told us." "What about it?" "About how the powerful people in Washington won't be punished." She held out the paper, which Ethan now saw contained a carefully drawn map of their property. "I think we should name our ranch after Mr. Hayes." Ethan took the map, studying the neat lettering at the top. Hayes Memorial Ranch. Below it, Sarah had sketched their cabin, the corral, and her garden, with proposed additions for the future. A larger barn, expanded corrals, even a small schoolhouse. "This is quite a vision you have," he said, genuinely impressed by her planning. "Mr. Hayes died trying to expose the truth," Sarah explained earnestly. "We can't make the senators in Washington pay for what they did, but we can make sure people remember what happened here. If we build a successful ranch and name it after him, it would be a way of honoring what he tried to do." Ethan looked at his daughter with pride and wonder. In the midst of all they had experienced, danger, violence, political machinations, she had found a way to create something positive and enduring. "Hayes Memorial Ranch," he repeated thoughtfully. "I think that's a fine idea, Sarah. A very fine idea indeed." As October painted the surrounding hills with gold and crimson, the first snow dusted the peaks above Crow's Ridge. Ethan and Sarah had worked tirelessly to prepare for the coming winter, stocking firewood, preserving garden produce, and ensuring the cabin was properly sealed against the cold. Their efforts were occasionally interrupted by visitors, Cooper with news from town, Eleanor with books and lessons for Sarah, and once even Chambers, passing through on his way back to Washington. The federal investigator reported that while the official investigation remained limited to territorial officials, he continued to gather evidence against the higher-ups. "Justice may be slow," he told them, "but it is persistent." On a crisp afternoon, as Ethan was securing the last of the roof shingles before winter set in, he heard the now familiar sound of a wagon approaching. Climbing down the ladder, he was surprised to see Carson driving, with Eleanor beside him. "Wasn't expecting you until next week," Ethan called as they pulled up before the cabin. "Everything all right?" "Better than all right," Carson replied, helping Eleanor down before descending himself. His movements were still careful but much improved since his last visit. "We brought something for the ranch." Sarah had emerged from the cabin and rushed to embrace her uncle. "What did you bring? Is it a surprise?" "See for yourself," Carson gestured toward the back of the wagon. Ethan and Sarah moved around to look. There, carefully secured with ropes and padding, was a hand-carved wooden sign. Carson and Eleanor worked together to lower it to the ground and prop it against the wagon wheel. "Hayes Memorial Ranch," Sarah read aloud, her face lighting up with delight, "just like I drew in my plan." The sign was beautifully crafted, the letters deeply carved and filled with dark stain to contrast with the lighter wood. Below the name was a simple image of a cabin, much like their own, with mountains rising behind it. "Eleanor mentioned your idea when she visited town last week," Carson explained. "I commissioned it from Thomas Jenkins, you remember? Martin's brother who does carpentry. The whole town contributed to have it made." "It's magnificent," Ethan said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "But why the whole town?" Eleanor stepped forward. "Because what you two did affected everyone in Silver Creek. You exposed the truth that had been buried for 15 years. You brought justice to families who had been cheated. You reminded us all that one person, or in this case 2 people, can stand against corruption and win. We thought you could mount it at the entrance to your property," Carson added, "where the trail meets your land, a declaration to everyone who passes that this place stands for something." Later that day, after Carson and Eleanor had departed with promises to return for a proper celebration once the sign was installed, Ethan sat on the porch with Sarah. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their land, the newly harvested fields glowing golden in the autumn light. "We've come a long way since that auction," Ethan observed, his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "From nothing but a broken pocket watch and 25 cents to our name. And now we have Hayes Memorial Ranch," Sarah said proudly. "Do you think we'll ever know the whole truth about what happened? About all the people involved in Washington?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart. Chambers is still working on it, but politics has a way of burying uncomfortable truths. What I do know is that we've made a difference here. People who were wronged are getting some measure of justice. Hayes' story is being told, and we've built something good from it all." "From 25 cents, Sarah mused, "the best 25 cents ever spent." Ethan nodded, looking out over their property. The land that had come with so much hidden history, so much danger, but also so much promise. "The best investment I ever made," he agreed. though not for the reasons I expected when I raised my hand at that auction. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the cabin in a warm golden glow, Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them here. From desperate poverty to unexpected danger, from exposing corruption to building a new home, their path had been anything but straight. Yet through it all, they had persevered, discovering strength they hadn't known they possessed. The sealed floor that no one had dared to open for 15 years had held secrets that changed their lives forever. But the true legacy of their 25-cent purchase wasn't measured in the money recovered or even the justice served. It was in the home they had built, the community they had found, and the future they were creating. A future symbolized by the sign that would soon mark their property, Hayes Memorial Ranch. In the fading light, with his daughter beside him and their home before them, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever challenges the future might hold, whatever powerful enemies might still lurk in Washington's quarters of power, they would face them together, with the same courage and determination that had brought them this far. Some legacies were measured in dollars and cents, in land and buildings, but the most important legacies were measured in truth, in justice, and in the courage to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. By that measure, their 25-cent legacy was beyond price.